the UK's Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak has been constantly under criticism regarding his wealth and somewhat lavish lifestyle. The latest findings show Sunak spent more than $600,000 of taxpayers' money in a span of just 2 weeks last year. According to the new data, Sunak used the money to hire a private jet for a last-minute trip to the COP27 climate change conference in Egypt. Downing Street has been justifying the expenditure, saying the jet was needed for vital meetings. Initially, Sunak did not plan to attend the COP27 summit, deciding to instead send his ministers. But after criticism from groups and lawmakers, Sunak U-turned on his decision. There in Egypt, apart from the $133,000 cost of the plane, all the personal expenses like meals, visas and accommodation were paid for by Sunak himself. Opposition lawmakers are calling the spending a shocking waste of taxpayers' money. The report also comes at a time when millions of Britons are struggling to pay their bills. Well, Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, has also criticised Sunak by calling him Mr. 1%. He's also criticised the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt's decision to scrap the top limit on tax-free pension savings in his budget. The Labour leader, while taking a dig at Sunak's privileged image, justified the term 1% by highlighting that only 1% of asylum claims have been processed, as well as just 1% of taxpayers' money lost to COVID fraud has been recovered. A summary of Sunak's tax return shows that he earned around $5.9 million, out of which more than $500,000 came from his MP and ministerial salary. The rest is attributed to the interest, dividends and capital gains on his US investment fund. Earlier, Sunak came under criticism over his new private heated swimming pool, which uses so much energy that the local electricity provider had to be upgraded. The cost is estimated to be around tens of thousands of pounds. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Nicholas Nugent, senior journalist and former BBC editor, joining us live from London. Nicholas, many thanks for your time this morning. And Keir Starmer's come out with that phrase, Mr. 1%. Do you think that's the kind of political attack on Rishi Sunak that could gain some popularity with the electorate?
Well, what we're witnessing here is the start of a really, what's going to be a really vicious campaign to win the next general election, which, as in India, we're due to go to the polls in about 2 years' time. But the contest is already underway, not least because we have local elections in 5 weeks. So what you're seeing is the sharpening of the controversy or the rivalry between the two people who hope to claim the post of Prime Minister in 2 years' time. But I think this 1% is an interesting challenge because I'm quite sure that Keir Starmer wasn't talking about wealth. That's how it's being interpreted. He wouldn't really talk about wealth because if we are calling Sunak a member of the richest 1% of the community, then there's a likelihood that Keir Starmer himself would also be in that same bracket. He's not a poor man himself. Though his income comes from very different sources from those of the Prime Minister. But what he was really getting at was low performance of the Conservative government in certain key areas. We had a budget last week in which it seemed that they were benefiting the wealthy members of the community. There was a tax concession for pensions, for example, that affected the very rich in society. So that was one of the targets. The other is low performance, for example, in processing asylum seekers. Fewer than 1% of asylum seekers, let's call them the boat people who are arriving on our shores illegally, fewer than 1% have been processed over 2 years. And that's quite an abysmal performance. And another one is the low performance on the zero emissions targets. In other words, climate change. The government set some quite specific targets by 2030. And they're not doing very well, as yesterday's announcement showed. So really, Keir Starmer was aiming at those things, but the risk is, or not the risk, but the newspapers have tended to interpret this as about wealth, relative wealth. And they're saying, isn't Keir Starmer throwing stones in glass houses because he's quite a wealthy man himself? But anyway, it was, in some reckoning, the start of the Labour campaign's election, the Labour Party's election campaign yesterday, when Keir Starmer made this statement. And we're going to see it get more and more vitriolic as time goes on. So I don't think the phrase Mr. 1% will really catch on. It might, we'll see. And Mr. Sunak indeed is quite sensitive about the fact that he's a very wealthy man himself. But what can he do about that? Maybe he'll fight back, and maybe he will produce some policies that tend to benefit the, shall we say, the 99%, or those who are not in the same wealthy camp. So it's Mr. 1% for the moment, but I'm quite sure that Rishi Sunak will fight back with something of his own towards the Labour Party, the Labour opposition, who currently are way ahead in the polls and thus most likely to win the next general election.
It's going to be fascinating viewing. Nicholas Nugent, senior journalist and former BBC editor, many thanks for your time this morning.